Chapter 6. A Peculiar Professor. Frank and Joe exchanged glances. Perhaps Professor Randolph really had bought the museum. "I think we'd better play safe and leave," Frank whispered to his brother. "If he's the owner, we're breaking the law by trespassing." "So gratifying to see you agree with me," the man smirked as the boys walked out. "You realize the cause of education must be served." He bowed stiffly. "What a character," Frank remarked as the three boys stepped into their car. "He reminds me of a comic strip villain." Chet bobbed his head to mimic a bow. "To be sure, my dear boys, it's all for education." "What do you suppose he teaches?" Joe grinned. "Young boys, and knows how to put them in their places." "Perhaps General Smith is acquainted with Professor Randolph," Frank suggested as they drove through Centerville. "If they're friends, then Randolph will let us in after all." Soon they reached the house. When the boys entered, they realized the general was battling with a problem of his own. He seemed decidedly agitated and was pacing up and down the living room. His red hair was rumpled. Frank was alarmed. What dire turn of events had occurred? "General Smith, what's the matter?" he asked. Aroused from his thoughts, the man turned with a start. "Matter? Everything! The house has been ransacked." "Good night," Joe exclaimed. "Since we ate lunch?" "It must have happened before then," the officer replied. "Nothing downstairs was touched, just the second-floor bedrooms." "None of us went up there at noontime," Frank recalled. "Was anything taken?" "Nothing of mine, so far as I can make out," the officer replied. "The things in our suitcases and dresser drawers were strewn about. You better check on your own belongings." Frank and Joe ran up the stairs 3 at a time, and Chet was not far behind. They found their room a picture of disarray. Clothes which had been hung in the closet lay on the floor, and contents of their bags were scattered over the rug. "Gosh," Chet moaned as he began to pick up his things. "I hope they didn't take it." "Take what?" Joe was curious. "I had a special box of attachments for my camera in this. Oh, here it is." The Hardys went on checking their belongings minutely, while General Smith watched. "All my stuff is here," Joe said finally. "Mine too," Frank added, rising from his kneeling position. And then he let out a sudden exclamation. "Wait! The picture's gone!" "The picture?" the officer repeated. "The half-man that Chet snapped in Bayport." "Well, that proves it!" Joe shouted. "Bush or a cohort has been here. Nobody else would want that photo." "Right," Frank agreed. "But I don't think that's what he was after. He probably didn't even realize that Chet had taken the snapshot." "It doesn't matter," Chet piped up. "I have the negative. And I even brought another print in my wallet." "Well, that's good," Frank continued. "But I'll bet Bush was after a map showing where the lost gold was buried." "But we haven't any map," Chet replied, perplexed. "Bush probably thinks that we have," Joe said, which indicates that he still doesn't know where to look for the treasure. By the time the boys had straightened up the place, General Smith had regained his composure. "We must get someone to guard this house when we're away," he said. "I know just the man for the job. If he's still in town, that is. I'll send a note to Claude." General Smith explained to his visitors that Claude was his old army orderly and was on vacation in his home in Centerville, too. The officer requested the boys deliver the note, as he did not want to leave the house unoccupied. He suggested they continue their sleuthing alone. Before going, Frank asked General Smith if he knew Professor Randolph, and told him about the incident at the museum. "No, I've never heard of him," the general replied. "But it doesn't surprise me that the museum's been sold. It always ran at a loss." Upon reaching Centerville, Frank parked in the town square. Joe offered to deliver the general's note and started down the narrow, cobblestone street where the orderly lived. As the others waited for him, Frank gazed across the square. His eyes lighted on the courthouse, and an idea occurred to him. If Professor Randolph had bought the museum, then the deed would be registered there. "Wait here a minute," he said to Chet. "I'll be right back." The courthouse was a low brick building that looked like a church without a steeple. 2 heavy white columns stood on either side of the front doorway. Frank entered and asked the attendant where the deeds were registered. He was directed to an office down the hall. In it was an old man, beside whose desk towered row upon row of thick volumes of records. "Something I can do for you?" he asked. "Yes," Frank replied. "I've been told that the old Rocky Run Museum has been sold to Professor Randolph." Said the man, peering over his spectacles. "That's news to me. Nothing of the sort has been registered here." "Maybe the deed was recorded while you were out?" Frank suggested. The man hooked his thumb into his suspenders and tilted back in his chair. "Son," he said, "I've been settin' here for 40 years, 'ceptin' for lunch. When I'm out of this office, it's closed." Frank smiled, thanked the man, and walked back to the car. "I had a hunch that Professor Randolph's story was fake," he told Chet and his brother, who'd returned from the orderly's house. "Well," Chet said, "if Randolph is still there, I think that old museum is a good place to stay away from." "I should say not!" Frank's jaw jutted with determination. "We're going right back to tell this Randolph that the place isn't his." "Agreed," said Joe, "and we're going to find out if Randolph has anything to do with our case." "Say, fellows," Frank whispered, "I think somebody's been watching us." He glanced in the direction of the hotel. "Who?" Chet asked. "I didn't see enough to identify him, but I saw a man slip into the alleyway alongside the building." Joe looked across the square. Nobody was in sight. "I don't like this," Frank said uneasily. "I think maybe we'd better try back route to the museum." "That's a good idea," Joe agreed. "If anybody's following us, we may throw 'em off track this time. Let's go." A sandy road led the boys off the main highway and through a stretch of woodland. The trees interlaced high overhead, making a canopy which filtered out the afternoon sun. "We're not going to get there in a hurry," Joe said. "This road's too bumpy." Frank deftly steered the car along the rutty road, avoiding large rocks which now and then jutted from the side. They drove down a little gully and then up a steep slope. "Hey, wait!" Chet shouted suddenly. "What's up?" Joe asked. "Look at those deer! I want to get a picture." 100 yards to the left, near a brook of the woods, stood 3 deer. "Okay," Frank said, bringing the car to a halt, "but make it snappy." Chet climbed out. He flipped open his camera case and then tiptoed into the woods. The deer, being downwind, did not scent the boys. They went on feeding. "Take them from there," Joe called softly. "I can't. I have to get closer." Chet walked a dozen paces, peered into his viewfinder, and then advanced a few more feet. In the stillness, Frank thought he heard the sound of a motor behind them. He looked back. No car was in sight, and the hum had stopped. "I guess I'm jittery," he told himself. "Hurry up!" Joe motioned to Chet. But Chet, thinking that he could get even closer for a shot, continued to advance, tiptoeing as he went. He dropped down to one knee, holding the camera close to his eye. The deer were in perfect range. But before Chet could click the shutter, a startled shout broke the stillness of the woodland, and in a flash the deer leapt away. Chet whirled about to see who had spoiled his picture. No one was in sight. In sudden panic, he raced back to the road. "Frank! Joe!" he shouted. "Hey, fellows, where are you?" But no answer came. The car was deserted. End of chapter 6.